another video podcast or vodcast from me, Mr. Summer Hayes, and this time I am wearing a silly hat on backwards, which is a first for these video podcasts, I believe. Anyways, this one is about Mussolini and the history of Mussolini up to the mid-30s, and then we'll look in subsequent ones at other stuff that happened in the mid-30s. Right, Mussolini. So he was originally a socialist, and he, even before World War I, was editor of a socialist newspaper called Avanti, and it was only after World War I that he decided that socialism wasn't working and turned towards the nationalistic leanings of fascism. Fascism, incidentally, just means bundle, but it came to mean a league of different groups, and Mussolini's fascists were dressed in the black shirts, and were called black shirts, and they regained order on the streets in Italy in 1922, and then Mussolini, with the support of the king, Victor Emmanuel II, and the army and big businesses and most of the right wing, he took over in a coup. This led him to be Prime Minister of Italy at the head of a coalition government for the first couple of years. He did, however, want it to become a totalitarian state, which fits in with fascism. So by 1923 he was embarking on his subtle imperialism. His big idea was to make Italy another Roman Empire, and he looked in his propaganda and his speeches back to those times, and talked about making the Mediterranean an Italian or Roman lake like the Roman Empire had, which is partly where his foray into Africa comes from. So 1923, his subtle imperialism, I suppose, was evidenced by the Corfu crisis, where he tries to, well, he does indeed bomb Corfu because of a border incident with the Greeks. This is really only any of use to you because it demonstrates where Mussolini is willing to use force, but also a failure of the League of Nations because they failed to do anything about it, and Mussolini, with his bullying tactics, ended up getting the compensation he wanted. In 1924 he bought Fiume, or he annexed it, going against an agreement he'd made 4 years earlier. So again, a little bit more subtle imperialism, but he couldn't do much more because his country was in the Mediterranean, and the British presence at the Navy in the Mediterranean was too strong, and he was on quite good terms with Britain at this point. But obviously, because there's that issue there was always going to be possible anxiety between the two countries. By 1924 he dropped democracy, so he'd started making Italy more of a totalitarian state. His government was having problems. One of his supporters had shot an opponent, and he acted swiftly and decisively, and by 1925 he was calling himself Il Duce, the leader. So from that point on, it was a police state using propaganda, all the trappings of fascism, and the first real state to use it. A lot of people were impressed with Mussolini. A lot of people saw him as a good thing, including Winston Churchill, who called him that Roman genius, and obviously Oswald Mosley as well, who based his British Union fascists on Mussolini, and also Adolf Hitler, who stole, maybe not the right word, but who borrowed a lot of the ideas of Mussolini's fascism. Throughout the 1920s, Mussolini and Italy were at war in Libya, from 1923 to 1931. So there's another example of his imperialism, and he supported King Zog's reign in Albania, and which becomes even more of an interesting fact in 1939 when Italy invades Albania. But in the 20s and most of the 30s, Albania was more of a puppet state of Italy, totally dependent on Italy and their economic and political support. So the first real major incident or conference that Mussolini had to go to would have been Locarno, where he was quite happy to be a great statesman and included in this international community, and he's putting his troops on the line to defend the western borders of Germany. That changes as you go into the 30s. Obviously the depression has an effect on Italy and hits them fairly hard, and Mussolini becomes more aggressive. He is obviously looking towards Africa and also to avenge a defeat in Abyssinia in the 1890s. Now, he traditionally, and with support of the king, would have looked towards the Western democracies, Britain and France, for alliance, for support. And Britain and France would have quite happily looked towards him as a buffer against Adolf Hitler when Hitler came to power. And initially it seemed as though this would be the case. There's a lot of history and alliance between Italy and Britain and France recently in World War I, despite the fact the Italians didn't get what they wanted from that Versailles. So why did Mussolini end up being on Hitler's side? Well, the Strys Front was called by Mussolini because of a couple of things, really, mainly to do with the Nazis. The obvious fact that Hitler had come to power and had designs on Austria, or people believed he had designs on Austria, and eventually proved to take it over in Anschluss, so he did. And that scared Mussolini. And there was also an attempted coup, a Nazi coup in Austria in 1934, which Mussolini foiled by bringing his troops up to the border at the Brenner Pass. And then obviously Hitler was rearming as well. So this had been recently stated at the start of 1935 about Hitler's rearmament, even though people pretty much knew that it was going on anyway. And that led to the Strys Front, which was an unofficial alliance, really, an informal treaty, I should say, because it didn't have any consequences. That didn't have any direct action that it would promise to do, say if Hitler did take over Austria. But it was a meeting of Britain, France and Italy, who promised to keep the status quo and keep Austrian independence guaranteed, and to generally keep an eye on Hitler's rearmament. Now, I'll go into that in a little bit more detail in a future podcast, but that was pretty much undermined straight away by the French, who signed an alliance with Russia, and then by the British, who signed the Anglo-German naval agreement with Germany. So from that point on, Mussolini was pushed closer to Adolf Hitler.